Hello, everyone. Welcome to Paint Your Town Red, bringing community wealth building to your town or city, a conversation with a group of innovating local leaders at the cutting edge of efforts to transform and democratize local economies all around the UK. My name is Joe Guinan. I'm Vice President of the Democracy Collaborative, a US think tank that has helped pioneer some of these strategies. We're delighted to be co-hosting tonight's conversation with Momentum and the World Transformed, and we're planning further events and activities aimed at bringing the tools and methods of community wealth building to activists and community groups, trade unions, and others over the coming weeks and months. We have an absolutely fantastic lineup of panelists tonight, including many good friends and comrades. With us are Matthew Brown, leader of Preston City Council and architect of the Preston model, as well as Rhianne Jones, Matthew's co-author of Paint Your Town Red, How Preston Took Back Control and Your Town Can Too, a book that came out on May the 1st and is already in its third reprint. Also with us is Jan Williamson, leader of Wirral Council and deputy mayor for the Liverpool City region and a driving force for community wealth building in her area. We're also very fortunate to have Paul Dennett, the mayor of Salford, architect of the Salford Way, also known as sensible socialism. And last but certainly not least is Joe Cullinan, leader of North Ayrshire Council in Scotland, Scotland's first community wealth building council, and one of the most ambitious efforts at community wealth building to be found anywhere. It's a really powerful lineup. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a brilliant discussion of what I at least would argue is one of the most hopeful and optimistic political economic developments of recent times. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to my co-host for the evening, Gaia Sriskantham, co-chair of Momentum. Gaia, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And I'm so happy to be here as an elected representative of Momentum's National Coordinating Group and to be co-hosting this event. Please do keep any discussion in the chat respectful, and we would love it if you could post any questions to the panel as we go along, as we'll have a Q&A session towards the end of the event. So we in Momentum are very committed to supporting community wealth building. We see it as a critical pathway to economic and social change on the ground. Community wealth building has emerged in response to a growing recognition that our economies, locally and nationally, are simply not working for the many, just for the wealthy few. And that this is more than just a policy failure, but actually intrinsic to how our economies are structured and how they operate. So left to their own devices after 4 decades of neoliberalism, our economies serve to concentrate wealth and power and redistribute it upwards into the hands of a tiny elite, with all the associated costs in terms of climate change, inequality, racial inequities, and regional imbalances, not to mention the dangerous effects on our democracy. The problem is that the economy we have at the moment is an extractive economy. What do we mean by this? An extractive economy is one in which wealth and power flow upwards to the elites who own all the assets. These elites make their money not by producing goods and services that are useful to everyone, but by owning assets and in an increasingly financialized economy. Landlords and property developers control land. Energy companies control natural resources. Banks control the money supply, and even CEOs make more from stock options than their basic salary. The economy is therefore built around the battle to control assets, which produces no new wealth, but instead extracts wealth from others, whether through sky-high rents, rip-off energy bills, outrageous bank charges, or share buybacks that bid up asset values. The same extractive logic applies to the natural world and the unsustainable extraction of natural resources that is pushing us ever further towards environmental catastrophe. There is no rising tide that lifts all boats, no trickle down, as the neoliberals would have us believe, but only the ever greater concentration of wealth in ever fewer hands through this extractive economy at work. In response, what we've seen is a recognition that if this is to change, so must the fundamental structure and institutional relationships of the economy. Instead of tax and spend redistribution, we need a new and transformed economy. To give us an introduction to what this new economy needs to look like, I'm happy to put us in the capable hands of Rhianne Jones. Rhianne is a journalist and author who writes on history, politics, and culture, and recently co-authored a book about the Preston models. Over to you, Rhianne.
Thank you, Gaia. And yeah, thanks for that introductory overview of the effects of the past 40 years of neoliberalism. I think what your overview illustrates is that there are so many obvious problems with our current economic and political systems, and that these problems have been left unaddressed for so long that making positive changes can seem like an impossible task. But what we're here to talk about tonight is the fact that there are workable solutions to these problems. Many of these solutions look back to previous political traditions of municipal socialism or syndicalism, and many of them just amount to common sense. Furthermore, crucially, these solutions aren't just theoretical. We're not just talking about them. They are things that have been put into practice, into action across the UK, and they've achieved political success and local support. So I'm just going to make 4 quick points in this introduction. The most obvious example to start with is Preston, where a local strategy based on community wealth building has been taking shape over the past 10 years. 10 years ago, Preston's situation was typical of many parts of the country. The city had been hit by deindustrialisation, by austerity, and by government funding cuts. And in this situation, the final straw was the collapse of plans for a shopping centre called the Tithe Barn, which was typical of 90s and 2000s style regeneration plans, these spectacular leisure and retail complexes, which were led by private developers rather than designed in the interests of local communities. So in Preston, the plans for this project collapsed in the fallout from the financial crisis of 2008. And it was this visible failure of older models of regeneration that was the catalyst for Preston Council to try something new. Basically, if developer-led business models dependent on outside investment hadn't worked, why not use your own internal resources instead? In Preston, this was done through a strategy called progressive procurement. Matthew and Jan will be speaking in more detail about this, but in a nutshell, this strategy involves working with local public institutions called anchor institutions. These can include hospitals, universities, colleges. Preston Council worked with these public bodies to adjust where they spent their money, identifying where they could buy goods and services locally, and then redirecting contracts away from multinationals towards local businesses, so the money stays within the local economy. So this strand of community wealth building challenges directly the extractive economic models that take wealth out of a local area. And in Preston, it's resulted in increased employment, higher wages, and more money circulating locally. Secondly, there's the way that councils like Salford, under Paul's leadership, are turning away from privatisation and outsourcing of council services, which has also been a central feature of the past 40 years. And as I'm sure everyone who's listening has observed themselves, when services become outsourced to private providers, you see costs increase, you see standards go down, you see pay and conditions go down for workers. You very often see corners cut on regulation, which threatens the health and safety of both workers and consumers. And all this in the interest of maximising profit for owners and shareholders. So outsourcing is bad for workers and service users. It's also bad for democratic accountability, because when local authorities outsource their services, they end up being less transparent and less accountable because they're not tied to a visible local layer of responsibility. Community wealth building can address these problems by bringing services back in-house, so insourcing instead of outsourcing, investing in local infrastructure and local employment, and also by encouraging worker ownership and economic democracy through supporting cooperative businesses, which is something Matthew and Paul will be talking about. Thirdly, I'll very briefly mention community wealth building and climate change, because I know we'll be talking later on about how it links up with the Green New Deal. There are already local Green New Deal initiatives happening on the ground, which are showing the potential for community action that addresses climate change, as well as safeguarding jobs. Things like working with trade unions on conversion plans for a low carbon economy, or community-owned renewable energy schemes. There's also plans for community land stewardship in the Welsh Valleys, and similar initiatives in North Ayrshire. So that's a further strand that I think Joe will be talking about later. And as well as climate change, I think ideas like this challenge the loss of public and civic space that we've seen over the past few decades through privatisation and gentrification. So there's something to say on how community wealth building can create a new commons. So a very quick introduction there to what community wealth building can do in practical terms. And I'll finish by saying that on a more fundamental level, perhaps, what we've seen over the past 10 years or so in movements from Occupy on the one hand to Brexit on the other is a reaction against how political and economic decision-making feels so remote to people right now. With the erosion of democratic constitutional channels for popular influence, it doesn't feel like decisions are being made in the interests of ordinary people and communities, which is where community wealth building comes in. It's a way of addressing this malaise, of engaging with the increasingly evident desire for influence and power to be placed in the hands of ordinary people, of taking back control, to adopt a slogan. And crucially, it's a way of taking back control in a way that doesn't give any ground to the kind of xenophobia, authoritarianism, and racism that is on the rise in the UK and beyond. Instead, it's a strategy that's rooted in socialist principles of democracy, egalitarianism, and cooperation. I'm delighted that so many people want to know more about it.
Thanks so much, Rhianne. And I just wanted to tell people listening in today that it seems like the chat on YouTube may not be working. All you have to do is check out our live stream on Facebook, and you can use the chat function there to ask questions. So please do that. And thank you, Rhianne, again, for that great overview of how community wealth building can be a direct answer to some of those structural failings of the current economic system. I think one of the most immediate and practical ways we're seeing of building this new economy in the absence of a national government willing to enact a transformative economic program is action at the local level. So we're honored to have some of the leading voices on community wealth building with us tonight. And before we go deeper into some of the issues that you raised, they will each take 2 minutes to introduce themselves and sum up what community wealth building means to them and the vision that they have for their local areas. And we'll start with Paul Dennett in Salford.
Thanks very much, Gaia. It's quite a task, actually, summing this up in 2 minutes. But yeah, I come at this from the perspective of obviously local government, being a leader in a local council. So for me, community wealth building is a new and often local and enlightened response to arrest what I would say is the drift of extractive forms of economic development, which have ultimately dominated people's lives and our communities since at least 1979. But for me, community wealth building is also a response to post-industrial challenges, also to the dominance and the transition to a service-based economy, which has exacerbated regional imbalances. And interestingly, we're increasingly talking about the need to level up and rebalance our economy. For me, community wealth building has a lot to say about how we do that. I also think it's a critique of the centralisation of the state and privatisation, and what we saw under New Labour broadly is defined as new public management and this kind of associated belief in private sector efficiency. It's an alternative to that. It's an alternative to private finance initiatives, public-private partnerships, which were often seen as the sole vehicles for delivering economic development and increasingly delivering public services. You know, that whole drift under compulsory competitive tendering and commissioning entities in local government and the hollowing out of the state, for me, community wealth building speaks to the heart of that agenda and provides a real alternative. It provides us in local government, in my opinion, with a framework to recalibrate the state, especially local government, providing an alternative model of economic development, which is in stark contrast to the austerity agenda that's been pursued since 2010, which in my opinion has probably accelerated and forced the market and often developer-led regeneration initiatives and global finance on local government and communities up and down the country. We talk about a framework, and what is that framework? For me, it's about ownership of the economy. It's about financial power. It's about fair employment and just labour markets. It's about progressive procurement of goods and services. And it's also about the socially productive use of land and property, which is something we've already heard about. Ultimately, community wealth building is a people-centred approach to local economic development, redirecting wealth into our local economies and placing control and benefits into the hands of local people.
And Jan, if you could go next, that would be great.
Thank you. Sorry, I've had a bit of trouble with my tech. Basically, what he said, really. So I'd like to thank you for inviting me tonight. It's really exciting. I'm the leader of Wirral Council. Prior to my leadership position, I was Cabinet Member for Finance. And when I assumed the role, my first thought was austerity had almost crippled a lot of local authorities up and down the country. Since 2010, we've seen half of our budget taken from us. And as a consequence, we've seen a loss of nearly half of our staff. Services were, vastly affected by this. And I thought I have to do more with finance than just balancing the budget. It has to be a fair budget, a socially just budget, and a budget that supports our communities. And so that's when I became interested in community wealth building, took myself up to Preston to an event up there and came back really inspired. For me, Wirral has massive inequalities. You can expect to live 10 years less if you live in the more deprived parts of the borough. You can have, there's deep deprivation and unemployment, worklessness, poor health, real vast inequalities in health. And all of that for me led me to absolutely look in a much more progressive way about how we spend our money as a council and how can we encourage our public sector partners to begin with to spend their money differently, to provide decent jobs, to procure locally, to invest in the local economy, to use our assets in a way that benefits the community, and to basically sort of try and prevent the extraction of wealth from Wirral by large-scale companies. I have to agree, regeneration in and of itself doesn't achieve many benefits for the community if it doesn't reinvest in the community. So where there are big projects on Wirral, it's working with the developers to embed social value and progressive procurement into all of our contracts with them. So we have to, for me, we have to look after our workforce on Wirral, we have to look after our residents, our community and our third sector, and we have to support our local businesses above all else. And so there's an opportunity here for Wirral Council, which we brought in Celeste to help us with our community wealth building strategy, which was launched last year. Unfortunately, COVID has kind of slowed a few things down, but we're picking up the reins again on Wirral. And one of the big things that we're leading on is working with our anchor institutions. I'll talk about that later, but there's a £2 billion spend with our anchor institutions on Wirral, and we have to ensure that where we can, that spend goes locally. It provides meaningful jobs, it looks after our young people, and it looks after our local businesses, and also the assets that public sector organisations have are used for the benefit of our community. So there's many things community wealth building can deliver and is delivering already for us on Wirral. But I'd say the main thing is that we have a much more resilient local economy and community. And post-COVID, that is absolutely vital in ensuring the sustainability of our local economy. Thank you.
Evening, folks. I'm Joe Cullinan. I'm the leader of North Ayrshire Council, so greetings tonight from Scotland. North Ayrshire is a area on the west coast of Scotland. Really, some of the stories here about deindustrialisation are really at the heart of our economic story over the last few decades, tracing back to the sort of late 70s, all the way through the 80s. We saw big employers leave North Ayrshire. We saw the jobs go and we never ever seen them being replaced. Previous councils under previous administrations, parliamentarians for the area as well, I think have played the traditional economic development game over that period, trying to attract inward investment in the hope that if it ever did arrive, that the benefits of it would trickle down to our communities. And quite frankly, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work for North Ayrshire. It doesn't work for a lot of areas across the country. We've got high levels of unemployment, high levels of child poverty, a weak labour market, and we need to look at an alternative economic model as a result. So for me, community wealth building is about that systemic change. It's a break from the neoliberal past. It's looking at recovering from the deindustrialisation of the 80s. It's about us as a council and looking at the anchor institutions that we're working with, using every single lever that we've got, from procurement to recruitment to our land and assets, to how we create new generative businesses such as worker ownership, cooperative social enterprises and creating a thriving economy as a result of that. For me, if I was to sum up community wealth building in a word, it's about democracy. It's about economic democracy and ownership of the economy, but it is also about democratic participation and giving people in the community a much greater say in their future. So for me, that's how I would sum it up, and I'm looking forward to tonight's session.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Matthew Brown, I'm leader of Preston City Council. I also do some work as well as a fellow for the Democracy Collaborative, so I've been on a very exciting journey with comrades here for some years, to be honest. So yeah, we're at a very exciting stage, really. We've got to look at the trends that we're seeing in terms of where we're going with this and how community wealth building as a movement's really spreading. So the story of Preston has been quite well documented already by Rhianne, who's the co-author of Paint Your Town Red with myself. I wrote it with Rhianne. And, you know, it's trying to be in control of our own destinies within the community, in the sense that we just don't want to rely on inward investors, on developers who aren't rooted within the community, who often extract wealth. We really want to be in control, really. So crucially, it's looking at the ownership of the economy, saying that at the moment, the ownership of the economy locally and regionally and nationally as well, it's in too few hands, really. The people within communities often not in control of their own economic destinies. So community wealth building is trying to actually put that ownership more in place, to be honest. And it uses a number of policy levers, and it works with a number of institutions. So within Preston, it's been about supporting the real living wage. It's been about where the pension fund invests that we're part of. It's been about procurement, not just with ourselves, but with the hospital and the university. But crucially now, we're on to the more transformative aspect of it. So we're looking to expand worker ownership within our community and employee ownership. We're establishing a banking alternative, a regional cooperative bank called the Northwest Mutual, and Jan's on that as well. We're going to build a big commercial development, but crucially, it's going to be owned by the municipality. So it's going to be the ownership of the city. So we have a say over local supply chains. Any profits will go back to the city and local labour, the kind of companies who want to develop it. We're looking at establishing a community land trust, the first one in Lancashire. We're looking at establishing a company to provide social housing again. And again, we're looking at district and community energy. So you put that together and you work with all the institutions, the community, trade unions in your local business community, small businesses within your place. It's a really powerful way to respond and actually build a really resilient democratic local economy that could transcend the current neoliberalism that all our communities have been subjected to, really. And the exciting thing is this conversation 10 or 15 years ago, in terms of ownership of the economy, you know, even Labour-led councils weren't discussing those issues, but now it's pretty much everywhere, and it's across the Labour movement. There's about 50 or 60 areas that are on it, but crucially, getting a very strong international dimension with some quite radical politicians in American cities, especially the Deputy Mayor of New York City, Phil Thompson. There's work in Chicago, and then also in Amsterdam, Barcelona, and Ireland, and many places across Europe. So there's a trend here about how, you know, cities and regions are actually responding to that economic model that we've had since 1979, as Joe said earlier, and we've just had enough of it. We've got the courage here to build a movement that's actually going to create an alternative. It's the hardest thing in the world, but it can be done. So within Preston, you know, we're building this infrastructure, but crucially now we're trying to get community involvement behind this. So obviously we're, you know, working with our community to establish worker cooperatives and food purchasing cooperatives and looking at these alternatives and educating the community about those alternatives. So the future's in our hands, and we've got to really take this opportunity. And this is just going to spread even further, really. So it's a very exciting time to be involved in local politics for me. And obviously, we've all got a responsibility now to take this further. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthew. And yeah, there's been a lot of aspects of community wealth building mentioned by the various speakers that just spoke. What we'll do now is we'll dig in a little bit to some of those elements. And first thing I'd like to discuss is procurement, and whether it's through councils or whether it's through this thing that was mentioned, anchor institutions. And maybe, Jan, we're going to bring you on next to sort of talk about how the council's procurement can actually be like a really powerful force for change. And maybe you could also describe in your own ways what an anchor institution is and why they can be an effective tool.
Thank you. I mean, particularly like a council such as Wirral, which is a large metropolitan council, has enormous potential to affect change. via procurement, via progressive procurement, because of course we are responsible for social care as well. And so we are a commissioner of large scale services. And so an example of our anchor institutions here are at the NHS trusts, the CCG, the Clinical Commissioning Group, Wirral Metropolitan College, Police and Fire, and the Chamber of Commerce. And so all of those partners have signed up to community wealth building and progressive procurement, which is great, because I think the first thing you need to do is to get your partners on board, because as I said earlier, there's a £2 billion public sector spend on Wirral, and we need to make sure that that is where we can, aimed at local businesses and local workforce. And so they have bought into it. We've set up a partnership board with them, which is just about to resume. But they have, along with the council, started to embed social value into their contracts. As a council, we procure many services and goods. And so we've had a social value policy since 2017. And essentially what that is, it's a framework by which we score contracts and tenders. And we've got IT equipment that does all that for us. And we intend to roll that IT equipment out to our partners so they can use it. And you can see at an instance what social value is being delivered by your potential business partners. So we ask for Wirral, if you want to do business with us and you want a contract from us, we ask you to deliver on a number of things. What are you going to do for our young people? What will you do for our care leavers? How and where will you procure locally? How do you treat your workforce? And how are you reinvesting back into your community? Now, I think we'd all accept that COVID has kind of had a really terrible effect on a lot of small businesses. So we have to kind of adjust things to take that into account, because we also want to encourage small businesses to get back on their feet and support them in doing that. But in general, there are principles of social value. And so far, we've delivered £6 million worth, and we've got another £10 million worth committed, whereby businesses have committed to reinvest in their local communities. So for us, progressive procurement can be a massive lever, as Matthew said, with our anchor institutions, and get them to focus on their employment practice, on the procurement practices. And they've all said that they can do it. I mean, they're obviously subject to national procurement legislation, but it can be done. And it's one of the kind of quick wins, I think, for local councils. Have a look at your procurement practices and get yourself a social value policy written now. So, yeah.
Great. And Matthew, I think I'm going to bring you in now, because you've also been using procurement, but you've maybe leaned a bit more heavily on anchor institutions. And I'd like to, maybe you can bring out why that's the case because of the context of Preston, and also talk a little bit about, any obstacles you faced with anchor institutions and how you've overcome them.
Yeah, a really good question, actually. We're obviously a lot smaller than JAM because we've got a two-tier system in Lancashire. So we're a district council. We are the largest one in Lancashire, I think, but we're still responsibility for one tier of local government. But yeah, what we wanted to do was lift up our city after the failure of the regeneration scheme that didn't work. So we thought, well, we're very lucky in Preston. We're the administrative headquarters of Lancashire. So there's two councils here, University Hospital, further education colleges, large housing association, which is formally constituted as a tenant-led cooperative. So we thought, within these institutions, there's about over £1 billion, if not more, going through the books. So we thought, well, difficulty bringing money from outside into Preston with investment and larger developers. Let's work with these institutions. And we worked with CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies based in Manchester, went through a big process of looking at the spend and making sure more was redirected to the local economy. So over a 4-year period, about 3 years ago, we redirected an extra 75 million to Preston-based suppliers. And they were, mainly family-based companies. They weren't the large corporations that often win a lot of these public sector contracts. And we estimated that was equivalent to an extra 1,600 jobs. And at the same time, our employment rate really got to a very high level. So that's why we did it that way. But crucially, though, Gaia, it's not just about procurement. Anchors can insource, they can look at what they do with the land, they can help us form worker co-ops like our university's doing. They can enter into a partnership with us with a housing company, which the housing association is looking to do, actually a council and housing company. So, crucially, it's about recruitment, assets, lands, investment. It's not just about buying local.
Thanks, Matthew. And I'm going to bring Jan back just for a second here. And Jan, I just wanted to ask you about the role of community and public banking. And there's this concept of the Northwest Mutual Bank. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Matthew mentioned that earlier, and I think, we seem to have been working on it forever, but I think it's probably about 2 years now from the point at which we first got together to push this forward. We're also working with Liverpool City Council as well, so that's the 3 councils. And it's about bringing, for me, there's a few things here. We have to absolutely tackle financial exclusion. We have a large swathe of the population on Wirral who are financially excluded through not having a bank account. And we know that the poverty premium exists and it costs people around about £450 a year not to have a bank account. They pay more for everything because they don't have direct debits, etc. We know that our local businesses are suffering. The government instructed high street banks to lend after the financial crash. That didn't happen. The only time a high street bank will lend if they can secure it against an asset. So there's so many people and businesses that are absolutely suffering as a result of the way high street banks operate. So that was really our motivation, and also the fact that the mutual will reinvest its profits back into the community. There will be an ethical investment strategy, and the decisions will be taken by members. It will be a wholly owned cooperative, so members can have a say on how decisions are made, where investments go. So to really, and it's a really exciting project. And we have reached a stage where we're advertising for an interim board and applying for our banking license. So it does seem a long time in the making, but it's moving on at pace, and it's great.
I know it must always seem like things are going slowly from where you are, but from the outside, it's looking good. So don't worry. I think now what I'll do is I'll bring in Paul Dennett from Salford, and we can explore another aspect of community wealth building, which is the creation of a more democratic economy. So, Paul, what does the democratic economy mean to you, and how do we build it? It would be great to hear about some of the good work you've been doing on housing and community-led housing efforts as part of that.
Yeah, absolutely, Gaia. I think for me, though, in the broadest sense, a democratic economy is about giving us an equal stake in the places where we live and where we work. We all know that the market economy is traditionally undemocratic, and also free market ideology combined with a highly centralized state has created huge regional imbalances, especially in the north of England. And ultimately, it's an economy that doesn't work for everyone. And those with money can make decisions, they can define our physical environment, and they can decide what services and commodities are provided and to who those services and commodities are provided to. So people are disenfranchised by the current economic model. And in contrast to the market economy, for me, the democratic economy is one in which collective institutions, so we're talking about local government, trade unions, cooperatives, community enterprises, work together and ultimately call the shots. I do think there is a slight difference, though, between community wealth building and the democratic economy. I think for me, community wealth building traditionally focuses on smaller scale local organizations, businesses, mutuals, to create almost a counterbalance to, as we've said, extractive models of economic development. For me, though, the democratic economy is a broader term, which is encompassing an array of ideas, really, of community or democratic ownership, which includes, for me, state ownership and municipal ownership. And that's where probably, it brings me on to what we've been doing in Salford. So there are examples of community wealth building. So working with organizations like the Broughton Trust or Inspiring Communities Together. These are community organizations often reliant on grant funding or public sector funding, and we've been working with them to build community-led housing. You know, we're going to be using some of our land holdings in the city to deliver 69 homes. Why that's important is because it generates a regular revenue stream to keep these fantastic organisations and institutions embedded in our communities going. And then in addition to that, we've been doing a lot of work working with our community, voluntary and social enterprise sector. We launched something called the 10% Better campaign. Again, another example of community wealth building, using the soft power of the mayor's office, if you like, working in partnership to deliver better employment prospects for our young people, really pushing the whole living wage agenda in terms of tackling poverty pay, and also tackling issues of fuel poverty. Other stuff we've been doing in this space around community wealth building, I would say, are things like working in Media City through a partnership with Infor and the City Council to create a homes of skills and technology, to think about those industries and sectors of the future and make sure we create opportunities and jobs ultimately for the people in the city. So that's very much about the skills agenda, business startups, but aligning it industrially with sectors of the economy we think are important to the city of Salford, like digital, media and tech. Other stuff we've been doing as well is working with institutions like the Islington Mill. We've been successful with European funding there, also Heritage Lottery money, Arts Council funding. The City Council has also contributed capital into that. And that's specifically to look at using our land holdings, using our capital and using the resources of the council to tackle a real issue in cities and towns up and down the country, which is, you know, artists, creatives and makers being priced out of these spaces. So creating an institution which will be there in perpetuity at the same time as around it, property prices and land prices are absolutely skyrocketing. It's a fantastic project, I guess, and I'm really looking forward to that being delivered and celebrating the success, because our artists and our creatives are really important to cities, places and our communities. Beyond that, there's other stuff we're doing, such as building council housing. I'm sure you know a little bit about that. We're building council houses in the city now, the most we've ever built since probably the 1960s, through our wholly owned development company, Derive. In December of last year, we committed 65 million to building 417 affordable homes. So far, we've financially committed to building 650 truly affordable homes. And we've also identified land sites across the city for probably up to around 3,000 homes, which is fantastic. This is at a time when the market is not delivering truly affordable homes. So using, if you like, the institution of local government to really respond to the housing and homelessness crisis that this country is facing. Beyond that, we're doing some really interesting stuff with solar farms and hydroelectric installations on the River Wirral to create electricity, again, using our capital borrowing powers. I think there's some European money gone into that. But again, that's to really tackle some of the issues in the energy market. But yeah, those are a few things that we're up to in Salford anyway. There's more I could say on this agenda as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. I think what I'll do now is bring in Matthew again. And Matthew, Paul mentioned the sort of various aspects of the democratic economy. And I think, you know, we think about co-ops, but also councils and the way they spend. And Paul mentioned this a development company that was actually owned by the council, democratically accountable to the council. Could you speak to the various forms of democratic ownership that you've been nurturing in Preston and the knock-on effects to the economy that you've seen through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think each Labour council's got to do it in a different way, to be honest. So obviously, Paul's inspiring what he's done actually, but a bit different in the sense that much larger councils. So we've done a lot really about trying to really influence the commercial economy, make that more democratic. So obviously there is the work we've done with anchors around procurement, but linked to that and separate to it as well is this plan we have to have 10 new worker-owned cooperatives in Preston. So we've incubated 4. So that is a cooperative education centre recently registered, Preston Cooperative Education Centre, Northwest Black Cabs, Preston Digital Foundation and the Larder. So what a network of worker-owned businesses where they can all support each other. And crucially, I mean, if you talk about the taxi drivers, for example, there's going to be 8 to 15 in the business, which has been recently registered. And obviously the pandemic's put it back a little bit, but potentially you could get, over 100 in that. So that's the way we're trying to do it. And then the council's looking to do more as well in terms of the major development we're doing in the city centre, which will be publicly owned. Obviously, we're with Jan and Liverpool establishing the regional cooperative bank, the North West Mutual. And then there's been insourcing we've done as well, a little bit of that. And then we're looking at our land and assets. So we got some spare assets. We're trying to get the first community land trust in Lancashire there, really. So that's the way we've done it. We've tried to really work with partners to actually push this agenda, but crucially make the commercial economy more democratic. Because Preston City Council, it's not done an awful lot of that outsourcing anyway. So if we had done, obviously that would be our first priority. But it's really using the influence that a Labour council has, and that's the power of it. If you've got a council that's very, got really big ideas like we do have in Preston, you can influence so many people within your local economy and community and create that movement. Really, that's what it's about.
Thanks, Matthew. We have a question from the audience, I think from either Chi or C. Davis, just talking about the impact of climate change and how it's an urgent need to address it. So I think I'm going to bring in Paul again, and then maybe we can transition to talking a little bit about climate and community wealth building's role in that. Paul, you mentioned some of the energy projects, the council energy projects, but you've also been looking at housing, and we know that housing is buildings are one of the biggest source of emissions for the UK, and that's a critical part of how we need to reduce emissions. Could you talk a little bit about how you're trying to do that in the context of your social housing projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the homes we're building in Salford, we're trying to get as close or at net zero carbon as we possibly can. Clearly, there are ongoing viability challenges, but the quality of the homes we're actually building, it's called Fabric First, but it's near to net zero carbon. That still doesn't address the issue of embedded carbon. And as you've rightly highlighted, the construction industry as a whole is probably one of the biggest contributors to some of the challenges we face in terms of climate change. But absolutely, net zero carbon and also our carbon neutrality target in Greater Manchester of 2038 is very much at the heart of what we're trying to do through Derive and the wholly owned company. What I would say, though, is beyond just the housing element, there's loads of stuff we're doing in Salford. Over the past 10 years, I think we've invested around 126 million in green spaces. We're really actively encouraging walking and cycling, active forms of transport, planting trees. We've built a second flood basin. We're doing a lot in that space, in addition to what I've said around the solar farm and the hydroelectric installation. We actually have something called a climate action board in Salford, and one of my cabinet members that chairs that, and that is basically tasked with delivering on this agenda for the city of Salford, working with partners as well.
Brilliant. I think at this point what I'll do is bring in Joe from North Ayrshire, because I know that you've been doing quite a bit around climate there. How are you seeing in your vision of community wealth building being a part of a Green New Deal and taking on the climate crisis? And have you specifically been trying to do this on the ground?
Yeah, thanks, Gaia. So, I think I said at the start, this needs to be about systemic change. And one of the big systemic crises that we face is obviously the climate emergency. So if we're going to change the economy, it needs to be a change in the economy which fits with the declaration of a climate emergency. So as I said earlier on, we're trying to use every lever that we have at our disposal to try and really take community wealth building forward. Paul would spoke about the land and assets, and I think that's where a story's starting to develop about the work that we're doing in North Ayrshire. We are looking at all the sort of land that we own as a council, thinking about how we're going to use that, how we're going to put it back into productive use, and make sure that we don't take that traditional model, which is here's a piece of land, let's try and sell it to a volume builder, get a capital receipt and manage austerity, which I think has been the kind of story across UK councils over the last decade or so. So as part of that mapping out what land we own, we're looking at how we use it and use it in a way to contribute to our net zero target. So Paul spoke about their planting trees. We've put in place a tree planting programme to plant 108,000 new trees over the next few years, looking at the locations that will happen in, and working with community groups so that they can take sort of ownership of that. That will take the form of stuff like community land trusts, etc., in key locations for us. The second thing that we've done, and we just approved a second one yesterday, is council-owned solar farms. So we've been putting solar panels, we've been looking at renewable energy and various other forms on our existing non-domestic buildings, so schools, the council's HQ, etc. have got solar panels, etc. But we're ramping that up to actually delivering some council-owned solar farms that should provide the energy that the council will require to use. The two sites that we have approved are actually our former landfill sites. And the way I would pose the question is, what do you do with former landfill sites other than put renewable energy in it? Renewable energy that then reduces your carbon emissions, provides the council with energy, and also crucially brings an income stream to the council. So over the period of the business cases that we've set out, this is going to bring in about £25 million to North Ayrshire Council's coffers. 15% of that will be set aside for community benefits, so it'll give funding to community groups, particularly to take forward their own green initiatives. But the rest of it will be there to be reinvested in additional projects within North Ayrshire, which go through a community wealth building lens. It won't just be about, right, we've got 2/3 of our energy now provided by the solar farms. We think that we can go further than that. We think we can go further than that by exceeding our own energy needs and actually selling energy to other anchor institutions in North Ayrshire and Ayrshire as a region. So we have started conversations about joint procurement of energy across Ayrshire as a region for the public sector. But if we can generate the energy ourselves and sell it to them direct, then I think that would be community wealth building in action and would certainly make a difference in terms of the climate change agenda.
Great stuff. And Joe, while we have you here, it'd be really great to hear about the prospects for furthering community wealth building and specifically the Scottish context and the specific maybe challenges and opportunities that provides. And maybe you want to touch a bit on the Scottish National Investment Bank as well in the context of that.
Yeah, we do have a different context, I think, from where Matthew, Jan and Paul are down south. I think this will probably be the second time that my administration have influenced the legislative agenda in Scotland. We were the first council to provide sanitary products in schools, and then, as people might know, Labour MSP Monica Lennon, as part of her campaign, managed to pass sort of the world's first piece of legislation to tackle period poverty, and we were very much part of Monica's campaign. But since we've launched our community wealth building strategy, there's been a whole host of sort of policy documents published by think tanks and other groups in Scotland, all talking about community wealth building, using the community wealth building strategy that we've launched in North Ayrshire as a key case study. And at the election just passed for the Scottish Parliament elections, we saw community wealth building then appearing in some of the manifestos, including the manifesto of the SNP. So the SNP have now published their legislative agenda for the next period, and that includes a Community Wealth Building Act. Clearly for us, we would like to see that Community Wealth Building Act address some of the barriers that there are to undertaking a community wealth building agenda for local government, looking at how you maybe relax some of the procurement regulations, which are still tied to EU regulations, and maybe look at how that can be changed to make it much more progressive, to support local supply chains, to support mandatory payment of the living wage, etc. And also look at how maybe we could give councils additional powers, greater powers, to bring in vacant and derelict land, privately owned vacant and derelict land, maybe even former industrial sites, back into public ownership. These sort of pieces of land are found across the country. They are a blight on our communities. Our communities want us to take action on them and bring them back into productive use. But until such times as we have the power to actually intervene in that, there's going to be a challenge. So we would like to see that Act remove some of those barriers. You also mentioned the Scottish National Investment Bank. I think that's going to be key about how do they make sure that the investments that the National Investment Bank supports are addressing climate change and looking at the country's net zero targets, but but also does it support community wealth building and the sort of democratic ownership models that we've been speaking about tonight. I've got to say, when I seen the board of the National Investment Bank, I thought it looked like a traditional bank. There is no worker representation, for example. There's no trade union involvement, and that is a red flag for me. So I have serious concerns about the direction that the National Investment Bank will take. I also have concerns that it may well just back the traditional winners. So you'll see investment flowing in to, for example, the East Coast in Edinburgh, which is becoming a wee bit like the south of England, where all the issues round about land value, house prices, etc. And I think, thirdly, for me, the Scottish National Investment Bank needs further resources. So we're only talking about £2 billion of financial resources in the National Investment Bank. That's a tenth of what Jeremy Corbyn was talking about when he first spoke about a National Investment Bank for Scotland in 2017. So it's only a tenth of what we could have had under Jeremy. £2 billion to me just seems inadequate. £200 million a year looks to me like a wee bit of capital spend being reapportioned into the National Investment Bank rather than this really transformative approach to look at how we can support small and medium-sized enterprises and sort of cooperatives and worker-owned businesses as well. But I think it's going to be a source that certainly we'll be lobbying to get access to support community wealth building and the aspirations that we've got on it.
Thanks for that, Joe. Next, I'm going to bring back Jan to answer a question from Esme Dobson, who is asking about if you know of any councils that have done or innovative in terms of changing the model of adult social care, which is, using private care home companies, which I assume is the current model. Jan, if you could speak to that.
Thank you, and thanks for that question. Yeah, it's a really complex one, adult social care, because since Thatcher brought in compulsive competitive tendering, of course, all of social care went out to the private sector because councils were legally obliged to go with the cheapest tender, regardless of the quality of it. And so that's why we've ended up where we are with the scandals that we've seen in recent years around care homes and the treatment of residents in those care homes. It's not an exaggeration to say that, we're over a barrel as a local authority with care home providers. So, but on a city region footprint, because luckily for me, I've been given inclusive economy and community wealth building my portfolio on the combined authority. So because of what we're doing on Wirral, so I've been asked to roll that out. So there's potential there to work on a bigger footprint around adult and children's social care. What we could and did do during COVID, we were one of the first councils to give our care workers the real living wage. The sad thing about that, of course, is whilst we made the finances available to private care homes, a number of them didn't take us up, didn't use it, and didn't pay their staff the real living wage, which was absolutely bizarre because we were given them the money to do that. So that was a battle that we still have. Similarly, we provided adequate funding for sick pay for care workers who were tested for COVID, or more importantly, didn't want to go for a test in case they did test positive. So we've got a real problem with social care. Just to bring it down to children's social care, we've seen our care providers ramp up their fees by 17% because, again, they know that it's a cartel almost, that market for councils like Wirral. So we are looking to bring some children's services back in-house around residential facilities. Currently, our spend on a small number of children with complex needs is phenomenal, and they're being dictated and exploited by private providers who don't care about our children and don't care about the borough. But it's a big task, adult social care, but it's certainly one that we've started to think about in terms of at least ensuring our workforce is rewarded, and then we have to start thinking about how can we bring some of this back in-house. But it's I won't sort of gloss over this one. It's a mammoth task for authorities that have social care as one of their statutory services, but we are making a start on that.
Thanks, Jan. I'm now going to bring in Paul again. Paul, there's a question from Jade Spencer. There's a risk of Tory governments legislating against community wealth building policies if they become more widespread. And Jade is sort of referencing how Thatcher reduced the power of and destroyed radical local governments like the GLC in the mid-80s. Do you see that as a threat, and what would be your mitigating approach to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously national government always has opportunities in terms of the legislative process, which we have limited control over at the moment. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, for me, what drives this is morally and ethically doing what's right at the end of the day. We know extractive forms of economic development have led to increasing poverty and inequality in our cities and our towns and communities up and down the country. And I think, you know, morally, it's incumbent upon us as political leaders to actually use political office to see what we can do to drive a progressive agenda for the people we seek to serve and represent. So lobbying and influencing national government has been part of my role ever since I've been in this job. And I find myself disagreeing with most things they do. And I think for us, it's really incumbent upon us as progressive local authorities and local authority leaders to actually work together to influence the agenda nationally, rather than sitting by waiting for government to do whatever it decides it's going to do. I mean, let's be clear that the Tory government are never going to legislate in our favour. So what we're going to have to do is be creative and find ways to best serve our communities and the people that have elected us to represent them. So yeah, I mean, it's always a threat, isn't it? But I don't see it as too much of a threat. I mean, one of the things we talked about around the development company was, you know, changes around right to buy and whether or not government would apply those to wholly owned development companies. There's still an uncertainty around that and whether or not government decide to do that. And there was talk off the back of a pilot recently, I think in the West Midlands, about them applying right to buy to registered social providers. I've not heard anything more recently on that. But, you know, these are inevitable risks, and I just think we have to grapple with them as and when they arise. But I don't think we should be complacent. We should be working with each other to make sure that sort of stuff doesn't happen, and including working with our parliamentarians in the Labour Party.
And I may add, working with activists on the ground to demand these changes from their elected politicians as well. So we need to build that groundswell from below, I think. I'm going to bring in Matthew now to answer a question from Naira Bello, who's a councillor in Camden. And she'd like to hear what kind of strategies you follow to overcome ideological barriers from people in councils, not only councillors, but public servants who don't believe in such ideas. How we frame the approach to get key people on board.
Well, it took some time, to be honest. I just think that people were very open to new ideas, in the sense that we had austerity in Preston, and also we had the failure of the traditional economic development approach that was said quite eloquently earlier. So, yeah, I'd been really inspired by economic alternatives in Mondragon in Spain, where they got the network of 100+ worker cooperatives, Emilia-Romagna, region of Italy. And you see, by having that democratic ownership and worker ownership that predominates in those regional economies, you know, life expectancy is better, inequality is better, the mental and physical health of communities are better. So I was trying to bring that into a context where we had all this failure around us, where, you know, people were saying for ages in Preston, you know, the Tide-Born scheme is the only game in town, it'll bring jobs, prosperity. And we tried to facilitate it for over 10 years and it didn't happen. So people were really open to those new ideas. So that did help. But, you know, I was just very strong-minded about what I wanted to do, to be honest, and I still am. And eventually you win people over. So people aren't used to hearing in local government ideas around ownership of the economy, worker ownership, municipal ownership, you know, community ownership and other things. But eventually, if you actually explain that they actually are good for the community and they can win us support, as well as improving the community, which is obviously much more important, then you do actually get open minds, to be honest. So, yeah, it was amazing how we managed with our council. We started, you know, with living wage and procurement. We got that collaboration, and it's even gone, you know, with our university supporting us in worker ownership. And, you know, one of our biggest housing associations insourcing away from, I think it was Sodexo, you know, some major contracts, you know. So you do get that coalition of ideas, and I think the way you've got to do it is perhaps say it in very common sense terms, because I'm very political, as you can probably imagine, but I also speak now in very common sense language, that it doesn't make sense that we have assets that are given to corporations that don't pay tax, that pay workers a minimum wage. We give contracts to people where, Kerr was mentioned, where they have these 15-minute visits where they're not paid for it. It actually doesn't make common sense to do that. So everything we've been told by the establishment about how to do economic development since the late 70s is not common sense, in my opinion. It's very uncommon sense. And I think what I've done with community wealth building is really appeal to this idea. We're in a complete mess, so let's bring some common sense back into this. And I think the idea of who owns the economy, that it's not just in the hands of the top 1%, who often aren't, living in our communities. It is actually extreme common sense, and that's why we need to actually use that common sense language to win people around, and eventually you will do. And look where we are now. There was, probably 5 years ago, there was 3 or 4 leaders on community wealth building. There's now 50 or 60 in the UK, and obviously you even get in the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish government on it now, and I think the Assembly in Northern Ireland, there's a Sinn Féin deputy minister there, I think, who's introducing a community wealth building programme. So it's huge, you know what I mean? So just keep at it, and eventually you will actually, win people over.
Great stuff. My next question is for Joe Cullinan. This is on local democracy and the sort of control and management of enterprises by workers. And this is a sort of question of the place of community in community wealth building. And Joe, you mentioned the need for democratic participation, and we know about tools like participatory budgeting and things like that. But, if we're valuing this approach, which is very open, participatory, where we're a big experimental, what if localities choose to pursue something which are not seen as the right answer by community wealth building practitioners? Have you come up across situations like that? And also, how more broadly are you trying to nurture full participation in your community wealth building?
Thanks, Guy. I think it is a really good question, but I've got to say, in my experience, so far, nobody's come up with the wrong solution. I think you've just got to trust your communities that they will make the right decision. And I think the question, when I seen it coming through the chat, was also talking about democratically owned businesses as well. And I've never known a worker-owned business to, for example, fire their staff and then rehire them on worse terms and conditions. I think the experience of places like Mondragon has always been that where there is maybe a wee bit of a downturn in the economy, the workers have control to make decisions that protect people's jobs and make sure that they still maintain their livelihoods. So I'm really confident about giving control to people over their lives, and I think they will make the right decisions. You mentioned participatory budgeting. We do participatory budgeting in North Ayrshire. The Scottish Government want all councils to do participatory budgeting in Scotland and give up 1% of their budget to participatory budgeting. However, it's probably quite usual with the Scottish Government, to be honest, but participatory budgeting in Scotland is not what participatory budgeting started out like in Porto Alegre in Brazil. In Porto Alegre, it was seen as a way of challenging capitalism and challenging capital and giving people control back over their lives. In Scotland, it's largely been limited to small grants. So the council has a pot of money for small grants, and rather than a set of councillors sitting in a room deciding what community groups are going to get a couple of £100 or £1,000 or whatever, they bring people into a community centre, people come together and they vote on what projects they want to support. And that's great. There's a real thriving sort of atmosphere at these events. But it's not the change that you need to see in terms of democratic participation. So we've went well beyond the limits of that approach. We have used participatory budgeting on how we spend mainstream council budgets. So we had the process of saying, here's the grounds maintenance budget for your area. This is how it's currently spent. What would you like to see it spent on as an alternative? And people decided that they didn't want to cut grass in certain areas. They wanted to plant wildflowers. Rather than planting flowers in flower beds, some people in localities wanted to grow fruit and veg and provide free food for their community. Rather than just planting trees, they wanted to plant orchards, etc. So giving people control of that process was a really good, worthwhile project. And actually the staff involved in it saw that connection with the community in a way that they'd never seen before. So they valued that process. as well. In terms of facilitating community wealth building, though, and facilitating that transfer of ownership of land and buildings to the community, we also set up a community investment fund. Originally, had £3 million of money. We gave that to our locality partnerships, devolved responsibility down to them to really back the projects in their own locality area. And we've seen that being used, for example, by a group on the island of Cumbria to take ownership of their town hall. They get £200,000 for your community investment fund, and they've now raised £3 million to renovate it and restore it back into a functioning town hall for the island. We've seen a disused part of Salkit's train station brought back into community ownership and turned from a dilapidated part of the building into a training centre for local youth, young people connected with the karate club. And we've also seen like open spaces enhanced by stuff like outdoor gyms, etc., run and owned by the community. So that's been really successful. And actually just yesterday, it's been that successful that my cabinet agreed to top that up by another £3 million. So we're going to see another round of community investment funds going out to the community, and that will hopefully support the transition of community ownership of land and assets that we've been speaking about this evening, Gaia.
Thanks so much, Joe. And while I've got you here, I wanted to ask you a question. You mentioned sort of like the presence of unions on the investment bank. I'd like to ask you a broader question on unions. What is their role in community wealth building as you're seeing it in your locality?
Okay, so one of the things that we've got in North Ayrshire, and Joe G, who started this evening's session as a member of it, is we have an expert panel supporting our journey on community wealth building for a sort of strategy and policy angle. And one of the members of the expert panel is Ros Foyer, who is the General Secretary of the Scottish TUC. And it was really important for us as we established that expert panel to make sure that there was somebody there representing the trade unions and representing workers. So Ros is there. She's having a really valuable contribution at that expert panel, and she's bringing the STUC's ass to the table around employment, terms and conditions, the real living wage, and how we embed stuff like that into our community wealth building practices. And that's been really successful. I think there's a further piece of work that we are starting to consider just now about what is the role of the local trade unions and their branches in our community wealth building work. And I think we'll have some progress on that the other side of the summer. But I think there's very much a role for the trade unions to be involved at a local level. I know Matthew, for example, is really keen as he sets up those worker-owned cooperatives to have the trade unions involved in developing them, making sure that they are union worker-owned businesses. And I think that's going to be absolutely key for any of us who are looking at democratic ownership of the economy. It needs to be trade union worker cooperatives rather than non-unionised worker cooperatives. I think that makes a big difference.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. And I might actually bring Matthew back in since you mentioned him. And Matthew, maybe you could expand a little bit on what Joe said about trade unions and how you're integrating them where you are.
Yeah, very exciting actually, Gaia. We've actually established very recently, as I said earlier, a cooperative education centre, and the members of that are the local trades councils. So we're looking at how we can bring unions into community wealth building. Very supportive of the Labour Council, what we've done around workers' rights and other things, but crucially, what we want to do is incubate worker-owned businesses where we get unions to support the members and others in the community into these businesses. So a really big one, I feel, is the gig economy, because we're experimenting with some ideas around this. And obviously, as we've seen during the pandemic, it's people in minority communities often who are exploited by gig economy companies. So we're very keen to look at alternatives to that. So I mentioned our taxi drivers before, but there's some early discussions around alternatives to the likes of Deliveroo and people who deliver your food, and whether we can do that. So we're really keen on that. Construction is something that we're exploring as well, but that's getting very difficult in the sense that we've got to get the unions to actually get people together to incubate a cooperative that might bid for council work. So we're looking at that, and then there's ongoing conversations with Unison about social care, because obviously the Unison position is in the northwest and across the country that they want to insource it, but in many circumstances that can't be done, and we're trying to design a model which Unison can support around worker ownership in social care that's not going to conflict with their policy there, really. So these experimentations are actually taking place now, but Preston's buzzing with these ideas around worker ownership. Obviously, the bank's going to support these businesses, but we're looking at former prisoners, we're looking at retrofitting, we're looking at cleaners, as I said earlier. There's quite a lot of interest in doing it, really, and it's creating that culture that you've got to do. That's Joe's mentioned, Paul's mentioned, Jan's mentioned. But if you make a start and you've got a very radical Labour council, you actually start getting there. And people start coming to you saying, I'd like to establish a worker cooperative, or I'm quite interested in your bank. How can we support that and invest in it, really? So these things can be done. But again, it needs to have unity in the Labour movement behind this, including with unions and Labour councils, because, we've had so many decades of neoliberalism just being embedded in people's brains that the only way we can actually run our communities and local economies is around extractive capitalism, and it isn't. There are alternatives out there. So it's really a process of education. And I feel the unions have got a key role in that as well. I mean, potentially the unions could support our banking alternatives and get the members to see that the large banks aren't particularly good for our communities. They cause a financial crash. They're withdrawing from the high street. They don't lend to local businesses. They don't lend to people. That isn't good for union members, and it's not good for working people. So we need that, broad coalition support. But these things can be done. And I do feel in a few places like Salford, Preston, Wirral, North Ayrshire, we're getting to a tipping point now where, something quite special is going to happen in the next few years.
Matthew, could you also address some maybe common misconceptions that might be out there? For example, the interpretation of community wealth building as a form of outsourcing that might maybe misconceptions within the sort of union, in the union sphere.
Yeah, and it's an understandable fear, Gaia, to be honest, because what the unions don't want to happen is that if there's a service that's in the public sector, it's then outsourced to a cooperative, even a worker co-op, and it ends up in the hands of shareholder-owned companies, and the members are obviously subject to worse terms and conditions. It's never been about that in Preston. It's about trying to say that, there are certain things that anchor institutions and local government don't provide. So potentially, instead of procuring from an outsourcing corporation, procure from a worker-owned business or social enterprise if you want, if you're not keen on worker cooperatives. So it's about looking at that, and then it's also trying to, incubate businesses in the commercial economy like worker cooperatives, and also looking at transition, because a lot of company owners are going to retire soon. They get to 60, 65, they need to sell the company on, and that's ideal for worker ownership and employee ownership. So we're supporting 1 million owners, which is trying to go to our business community and say, well, you've run this family owned business for 20, 30 years, it's been a fantastic asset for the community, but do you want to go even further and actually sell it to your employees? And if you start getting 10 or 20 of these businesses in a town or city, you're really getting a conversation about a different way to run your local economy. And then if you get the institution supporting it as well, and a bank supporting it, and an education centre supporting it as well, can you see how you've got an architecture for something new, really? So that's the way we've got to go. And again, it might be done a little differently in Salford and North Ayrshire and Wirral to Preston, but I think the principles, whether it's worker ownership or municipal ownership or community banking or insourcing, they're all the same, really. It's how we actually bring this to scale, really.
Thanks, Matt. Jan, I'm going to bring you in now to answer a question from Amanda Nichols about how local authorities ensure that policies and practices on equality, especially anti-racism, are embedded in community wealth building initiatives.
Well, that's a really good question. So firstly, any main policies, whether they be new ones or refreshing, always have to have an equality impact assessment in place. So any change to policies, we have to make sure that no individual or group is detrimentally impacted, and that's standard for all councils. That's not just Wirral. But with regards to community wealth building, I've just been thinking about this. It's there's a few things going on here. So firstly, the role of the council is to help support local business, and so where people of colour are encountering racism in terms of conventional trying to set up a business, whether that could be a problem for them, and the council can step in and support. And we have a full-time employee in place that's we brought in specifically to help new businesses, social enterprises, businesses that traditionally can't seem to get support from the conventional route. So that could be a way. And we're always wanting to help progressive businesses there, because after all, you know, the local economy has to represent the local community. So I think that would be one way. Just as on this note, I have got a resident who's came and asked us whether or not we would help him find a council, a location in Wirral to do a mural for George Floyd. And so I'm currently helping him around not only finding one location, but a few across the city region, and possibly some funding for that. So that there's many ways that we can do that, but obviously also procurement wise, you can build into your social value policy criteria that may mean that you are addressing issues like racism and inequality within the business world. I think what Matthew was just saying, and just going back to the previous question, you know, about encountering sort of hostility or opposition, I just can't see how anybody of any political colour could say that community wealth building is not the appropriate response to a decade plus of austerity. It absolutely makes sense. And so I think more people are open to this now. Discussions like this really help us. And I think that when people see your passion for it, and also the practical case for it, paying a living wage, as the figures for that show that when you take someone off benefits and pay them the national living wage, over £13,000 is instantly added to the local economy. So there you've got that. So I think, just to finish on a quote really from Hegel, he said, "Nothing great is ever accomplished in the world without great passion." And I'll leave you with that thought.
You get extra points for worming Hegel into there, Jan. Nice job.
Thank you.
I'm going to bring Paul on now to answer a similar question from Salford's perspective on equalities and embedding that into the approaches that you're taking.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gaia. Yeah, I mean, Jan's already referenced the Equalities Act and the public sector equalities duty we have as local authorities to undertake impact assessments with the decisions we're making. But what I would say, in Salford, we've been doing a lot of work in this space, really. We've actually got an equality strategy for the entire city, not just for the city council, but working with partner institutions, the community and voluntary sector, and the private sector as well across the city to actually devise a strategy that speaks to their priorities. And, you know, just having a quick look at that, you know, at the heart of that, some of the objectives are removing barriers that prevent disadvantaged groups from playing a full and equal role in decision making, developing a better understanding of diversity in our city, a whole host of different objectives we're trying to achieve as a city collectively. So going beyond, if you like, the equality impact assessment and the public sector equality duty, which we as a local council are bound by, but to think about equalities more in terms of, you know, our inclusive economy strategy, how we're tackling poverty and inequality in the city, all the work we're doing with our community and voluntary sector. It's to almost create just a culture that embraces equalities and diversity in the city, and it almost becomes normal rather than ticking legislative boxes through a public sector equalities duty. We've been doing a lot of work in that space to normalise it across organisations, not just within the local council, but to create a real environment that embraces equalities and diversity and celebrates that in our city, and make sure that we're thinking about that and acting on that in everything we do, really. So yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. And I think what we're going to do to round off is ask a question from Khalil to all of the panelists. Khalil asked, what's a single legislative change that you most want the government to implement to facilitate community wealth building? So, Paul, if you want to answer that, and then I'll bring on the others.
So I think, you know, in responding to that question, you know, I'm often struck by, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of need. And at the moment, we have a housing and homelessness crisis in this country. And I think if government allowed councils to build council housing en masse again, like we did post-World War II, when homelessness in this country was rendered statistically insignificant, that will fundamentally change people's lives. Scrapping right to buy goes hand in hand with actually allowing councils to raise the finance, to actually get on with all of the great stuff we've been talking about on this call, what I would probably refer to as new municipalism. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. And I will bring Dan on next to answer the same question. What's the single legislative change that you want the most to help you in your work?
I think nationalising social care. I think getting rid of the wealth extractors, the exploiters, the ones that don't treat our people who need our help the most with any dignity. That would be, for me, yeah, that one. We can't have a situation where people have reached their last few years and are in substandard residential homes, being left on their own with poorly paid care workers because the private company they work for doesn't even choose to give them the real living wage. There has to be dignity in that profession, and there has to be dignity in the way that we treat people who need us the most. So I would say nationalise social care and sort their act out over it. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Joe Cullinan, what about you? What big legislative change would you like?
Okay, thanks, Gaia. I suppose we've been thinking about that because we have the Community Wealth Building Act on the legislative agenda. So I'm going to be cheeky and mention two particular asks I think I have of that act. One is in procurement. I think it's time for a social licence to operate, which Joe, Guinian and others have been calling for since the start of the pandemic. That social licence would make sure that anybody who wants to get a public sector contract has to pay stuff like the living wage, has to recognise trade unions and all the other asks that we have in terms of progressive procurement. The second one, I think, goes back to that land and assets thing, and I fundamentally believe that they should be looking at compulsory sales orders. I don't think that the existing powers that we have to take those private-owned derelict and vacant sites into public ownership are enough, and compulsory sales orders which will allow us to do that and do that at a reasonable rate of compensation, I think is absolutely fundamental to how we tackle the issues of land and assets.
Great. And last but not least, I'll bring on Matthew to answer the same question.
Yeah, I mean, I go along with all those, but I think we need some stronger community wealth building act, the one that John McDonnell was proposing. So, interestingly, we're the most centralised country in the European Union. So, cities do have options to take things like water into municipal ownership, and electricity. In other European countries, even American cities have more freedoms that we have. So I think we need that as well, to be honest, definitely. But also as part of that legislation, something like a Marcora law where workers would have the first refusal if a company was changing hands to buy it, with government on potentially local government support and also incentives as well. Now, if you do actually put that together, then potentially you have help by government to move towards a kind of post-capitalist type economy within your regions. And I think that's where we've got to head towards, to be honest.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. Huge thanks to all of our speakers today. I think they've really shown that there is a way to advance community wealth building in a variety of conditions, whether you have a big council or a small council, depending on what institutions you have around you, the political context, whether you're in Scotland or England. And it would be great to hear in future sessions from people in Wales and Northern Ireland as well, which was mentioned. So Labour councils really can find a way to do things, even in the context of diminishing budgets. And we're hoping that more of them will do so. And there is a growing interest in this. I really wanted to thank, in addition to our brilliant speakers, our co-hosting organisations today, which is Democracy Collaborative, that has done so much pioneering work on community wealth building. Also, big thanks to the World Transformed, who have done a lot of political education on this and helped with the event today. This event is really just the beginning. We in Momentum are developing a community wealth building toolkit with the support of the Democracy Collaborative, and we will be working with local government reps across the country to build their understanding and ability to practically advance this on the ground, using some of the learning and the experiences that we've heard today. and building upon those. We'll also be providing resources to support Momentum members and local groups to understand how, as activists on the ground, we can demand community wealth building and support leaders to make it a reality, because it's a job for all of us, really. Also, the World Transformed will be holding events on community wealth building around Labour Party conference. So people are encouraged to get engaged in that. This is just the beginning, and we'll be sharing more information on future opportunities in our mailing list and social media. Please do stay involved, and we look forward to working with you to transform our communities and the economy from the ground up. Thank you, everyone.